Dr. Tony Adams. Let's give him a big Buckeye welcome here. So we got some questions that we have to ask him, and then we'll see how it all goes. And he said he probably wouldn't need any notes or anything, so we're hoping this.
I lost them. This is the boarding pass won't help me.
Yeah, the boarding pass will be of no help in this situation. So it's a privilege to have you here and recognize you as the Myers Lecture Series recipient. Dr. Adams has many significant accomplishments over the year. President of the American Academy of Optometry, or past president of the American Academy of Optometry, past president of the American Optometric Foundation, past president of the National Board of Examiners in the U.S., and that's kind of odd for an Aussie. I mean, that's an odd thing, being from Australia and being past president of the national boards here in the United States. A very cool thing. Let's see. Current editor-in-chief of Optometry and Vision Science still, and former dean at the University of California, Berkeley. The list goes on and on and on, pages of stuff. Recognized by the Academy with the first Fry Medal, which is near and dear to the heart here, with Glenn Fry being still really in these hallowed halls. You're in Fry Hall, as you may know, right now, so that's pretty cool. The Prentice Medal to Clay and the Eminent Service Awards from the Academy. Honorary degrees from Pennsylvania College of Optometry and the State University of New York. Elected to the National Academies of Practice and the National Optometry Hall of Fame. A pretty impressive series of accomplishments. Pretty sterling career, but the fact is we really kind of want to know more, and we really want to know more about Tony is what we want to know about. So we'll learn about what makes you tick. So I've learned that you were quite the tennis player in your youth, right? And you placed in the finals of the Victorian State Championship as a youth. But I'm kind of curious what happened to the athletic career, and why did you end up choosing optometry, and specifically why optometric research?
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for reeling off those awards, most of which I'd forgotten about, but thank you. The tennis, well, that was, to be honest with you, it was my parents, when I was about 8, decided that I and the rest of the kids on the street ought to be taken off the streets after school and given something to do, because we were getting to the point where we'd do clever things like throw stones at the light bulbs in the street and stuff like that. And so they got this poor person to coach us in tennis, basically put 50 of us inside 2 tennis courts and hit against the fence. And it led to a lot of enjoyment in tennis, and I stopped being a significant tennis player around about when I turned 13 or 14. And that was round about when I fortunately had a great doubles partner. And yes, I once got to the finals in one of the state championships, but primarily because of the other guy. And I found that that happens to me a lot in life, and somebody else has given me a good shot up. Optometry. Well, this is not going to be very exciting to you. I sort of wandered into it, or backed into it, or fell into it. I can't say that it was a plan. I had been interested in high school in architecture, and then I thought that I'm not really creative enough for that. It seems to me, in my ignorance, I thought architects had to be, number one, creative. And I think that's a nice attribute, but it's probably not the essential one. And then I didn't do too well in one of the maths classes, and towards the end of high school, and so I thought, I better not even pursue that engineering interest, because that sounded like a pretty interesting career that would fit. And so I was in no man's land, and my father played bridge with the mother of a guy that turned out to be a colleague of mine, and said, why don't you tell your son, she said, why don't you tell your son to go into optometry? It's a good profession in that it deals with people, and they work 9 to 5. So she got it half right, and so I went to a fair and got into it, and I was probably halfway through the second year of optometry before I had any idea what optometry was about. And in Australia, the first year is pretty much non-optometry. It's what we would call here pre-optometry. It's pre-med, basically, the sciences. I think we did an optics course which scared the life out of me. I couldn't follow it. It's ironic that that was the first course I was asked to teach as a faculty member. so they knew where to go for English. So that's that part of it. The research part of optometry is a different story, and we can deal with that one separately. After I graduated, and in Australia you could then graduate when you were like 22 years old from optometry school. I'd like to tell you I was 12 years old, but that won't add up for you. After a 4-year post-high school, and 4 years was 1 year longer than a bachelor's degree at that time in Australia, you could do most of the professions: veterinary medicine, optometry, probably not medicine. I think that was a little longer. So when I graduated, I didn't quite know what to do with myself, and I wasn't quite ready to get married. I wasn't quite ready to commit to a practice in a big town, which somebody had offered me an opportunity. Actually, the fellow was the mayor of the town, and that scared me. The optometrist was the mayor of the town. And somebody called Henry Hofstetter, who was nearby here for many years, at that time was on international optometry circuit and wrote a book, I think, on international optometry, if I remember right, in addition to one on industrial optometry. And he wrote and said to the colleague Barry Cole, who was our one and only lecturer in that school at that time of my graduation, if you have any students who are interested in doing graduate work, let them know that we can probably find an assistantship for that person. So I practiced for about 5 or 6 months, and then I learned that I got this assistantship at Indiana University. And I only really wanted to go there for 1 year and then get back doing practice again. And the very first thing my advisor said, another name I'll throw out because people like Mel and some of the others will know, Gordon Heath, said to me, it's not got to do with getting a master's degree, it has to do with how long you're here. And I thought, well, that throws a spanner in the works, the wrench in the works here. Because I was going to do 1 year, have seen the world, or at least this part of it, Midwest, and gone back and set up practice again. It happened that universities here had a very different impact on me than my image of universities in Australia. I thought when I was at Melbourne University that there wasn't anyone there, especially the professors, who could care less about things like tennis or football. I mean, universities there don't have football teams, they don't have basketball teams, they don't have any teams to speak of. And I thought they were just all eggheads that I would not want to emulate. And but when I came here, I found out there's sororities and fraternities and football teams and good ones and swim teams. And then I met people in the swim team, 3 of whom had already won gold medals in Australia for swimming. And I thought, this is a different deal. And I got to thoroughly enjoy academic life because of that. And I did stay on longer than the 1 year. And in the 3rd or 4th or 5th year, I actually got married. And again, married to an American meant I was a bit more committed to the soil. And Elna, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. But Elna's was from Chicago area and went to grew up in Evanston, Wilmette area. So I got into the research again, sort of backing in with a different agenda when I came in, and noticing that I backed into optometry and backed into research colours how I think about what's important in life. Thank you.
I'm just going to point out that around here, the football team at the Indiana University is not looked at as a very strong football team. I'm just going to share that. We have other teams we follow here more closely than that. But
well, it was the worst team in the Midwest when I was at Indiana.
And they seem to like to have that title still
Yes.
today.
I always remember they had a football coach about that high, and he would draw people for lunch on Monday morning quarterback, and I couldn't figure it out. He was losing every week.
So if it wasn't for optometry, what do you suppose you would have ended up doing? You say you kind of looked at architecture and engineering, but now looking back, if it hadn't been for optometry, where do you think you would have ended up?
I don't know, and there's a part of me that wants to say I don't care. I don't think it was very important. As it turns out, that's part of this philosophy I've developed. I think there's just a whole range of fields that one can get into, and that success in it probably isn't related to making that right choice. I think there's things more fundamental that make you successful in whatever you choose. But I don't know what I would choose. I must say I've had a long fascination for the potential of the oceans, believe it or not. Because I used to look at the maps, and then I go to geographical maps and I'd see mountains and valleys and see little lines drawn on to divide countries up, and they kept changing while I was growing up. And but the oceans were always flat. There was no map. And I was thrilled, I'm going to say 10 years ago, but it was probably 20, when somebody put out a map of the oceans, the depth and the mountains and the valleys and so on. But what fascinates me still is that they seem like an underutilized resource, that they could be farmed, hopefully not in the way we farm on land, but farmed nevertheless, and provide some interesting answers. I mean, I don't know about you, Jeff, but when I learned that there's an organism 3 or 5 or 10 miles below the surface of the ocean that doesn't need oxygen to live, I thought that throws everything off, doesn't it? I mean, we're looking for life on other planets, and we think there's got to be some oxygen and some water and something. I don't know. So that's the long answer.
Well, you bring up two fascinating points. Number one, people who are successful in one area of study or venture generally are the kind of people who could be successful any place you put them, right? I mean, because they're going to put in the time and the effort and the dedication and devotion to be successful in those arenas, and I think that's an important piece. The other thing that I'm hearing is, even after a number of decades in studying things in the eye, there's still a curiosity that you have with things outside of the profession. You're still curious about different kinds of things, which really is the hallmark of a real scientist, I think, to continued and long-ranging curiosity. So I think that's fascinating. That's good stuff. So we've talked about your varied career, but there's two elements that I kind of left out on that list that I'd really like you to kind of talk a little bit about, because I think one was a pivotal piece in terms of the research of optometry as a profession, and the other I just think is such a unique piece and opportunity that you've had for the profession that I think it's of value to kind of share a little bit about that. And the first is the American Academy of Optometry's Committee on Research and how that developed and what that's developed into. And then also your work with the National Eye Institute through the National Institutes of Health here in the United States.
Yeah, that's a good lead-in to far too many things, Jeff, so I'll try and be a bit more disciplined than I have been on your first two questions. But I want to say something about curiosity, because you may not get to it, but I've become convinced that curiosity keeps you alive, that it's very fundamental. That I see people, at my age I'm starting to see too many, that die. And some of them have lost, not too long before, the interest in asking questions. And so short of a chronic illness or an acute illness, I'm pretty convinced, I'm becoming more and more convinced that maintaining a curiosity, or whatever it is, if you can, is probably very critical to actually living. So, yeah, non-trivial to me. It's one of those things I've pondered in only recent years, and I see, gee, it's amazing. The people who stay alive till they're 95 or 100, they're all sharp, and they all ask questions, and they all want answers, and they're dogged in that respect. So I hope, in as much as I am curious, that I keep it for a long time. The Academy's Research Committee is an interesting... the Academy to me is like the organisational equivalent of the perfect person. It's it's based on curiosity. It's based on camaraderie. It's based on fellowship. It's based on advancing knowledge bases. It's based on teaching, education. It's an organisation that's managed, although under many threats over the years, Bob will know some of those, managed to keep that flavour to a large extent. So I've loved being part of it. The research committee is almost a funny story. The research committee, let me set the stage right at the outset, is probably one of the more important committees of the Academy. It gets involved with AOF, as Tracy knows, and looking at all the applications for things like travel fellowships and Gazelle fellowships and grants, and it just works very, very hard. So it's very important, and for a long time it was almost routinely consulted by the Academy Board before the Academy Board did something. And Bob and I can sort of remember some of those days. It's less so now because the whole organisation's matured in many ways. But I remember being asked to be on the research committee a long, long time ago. And I said yes. And then the research committee had the job of introducing somebody. Well, it might have even been the Fry lecturer. And I remember getting up at the podium to introduce somebody else. The person before me was on the same committee as me, but I had never met him. And I thought, this is probably not a committee that's got it together. And it was a person I've come to enjoy professionally over the years, Tony DiStefano. And I've met him many times since, but I thought, this is wrong. This is not the way to run a committee. So the following year I was asked to be the chair of the research committee, and I said, not unless we actually meet, and we can meet till the middle of the night if necessary, because I don't want to be at a banker's lunch kind of committee meeting where the agenda's there and we sign off. It's all done, not a consent agenda. And to do that, I don't want to be in a hotel. So I asked people who were on the committee if any of them knew of Academy Fellows who had cabins in the woods or places buried a long way away from the city and so on, where we could just talk into the night. And those that didn't stay up, and those that did. And I still remember Donald Korb was on that committee. And the others on that committee that I remember were people like Paul Pease, Mert Flom, Leo Carney in Australia. Some of you know that name. I'm missing one or two. And he said, I've got this little place. It's not very special, but it's a little place. If you want, you'd be very welcome to come to it. So if any of you have ever been to this little place on Cape Cod, it's not a cabin. And it's not a mansion, but it's a long way from sleeping bags that I had in mind. And we did sit into the night on that. And I think the research committee came up with some ideas then that started some things like travel fellowships were basically invented by that committee. And to this day, that committee meets by going to somebody's house or a remote summer cottage or something like that. So it's become, it's given me a lot of joy. It's become a very important committee for the Academy. It gets a lot done. It nominates people for this National Eye Institute Advisory Council, and it's the committee that the Academy goes to when it wants to get names of good candidates for that. My role on the Eye Council was that I was on it for whatever it is, 2 terms I think is the limit, back in the 80s, early 90s I think it was. And it's a very important council for optometry and for ophthalmology in terms of funding research. And those were good days. Those combined, for a while I was going to Washington 3 or 4 times a year. The other one I kept going to was the National Academy of Sciences Vision Committee, which had a role in getting myopia research flushed out. And in fact, Don and Carla were somewhat recipients of the enthusiasm I had for trying to put a stick in the eye of the National Eye Institute because they hadn't supported human myopia research. Up until that time, they thought the only myopia that was useful was myopia studies on animals. So, National Eye Institute is also an institute that I'm appreciative of and very fond of being able to be part of it in a very minor way.
It's interesting you mentioned Don because he's part of the next little segment here, and that is you've had a lot of success mentoring some really huge names in research today. Ray Applegate, Cadilla Portnoy, Stu Richard, and of course Don and Carla, who are here and who we know quite well. And they've had really very strong careers. But you go back and you look, and these are all folks who had you as a mentor for graduate study. And but I'm curious first, who were your mentors as you were kind of coming up and learning and maturing as a researcher? And then what did you learn from those mentoring experiences, the mentoree, if you will, that helped you to become as strong a mentor as what you have clearly become?
Well, first, thanks for the compliment. And it is probably the thing that I would say I'm most proud of is the mentoring record. But fundamentally, I've discovered that mentoring is a two-way process. So while I can be proud of it, I've learned lots from it, lots. In terms of my own mentors, in addition to all of those people you're alluding to, and yes, indeed, they're people that I've been very proud to see do well. I would say there's 3 or 4 people who, and each one impacted me in a different way. One of them was this very first person when I was in optometry school. He was the school, Barry Cole at Melbourne University, and everyone else came in from a practice or somewhere to give part-time lectures. And the university had placed him in that position. So he was absolutely I mean, we had lots of times where we disliked him intensely.
That may still go on today.
Oh, no, it happens. He had a confidence and a thoroughness of checking. When he gave lectures, he had detailed notes, and he would research. And for every 1 hour of lecture he gave, I would guess he probably put in 10 hours of background research. So he was ready for us. And he was pretty easy to take notes from. And he didn't lighten up until towards the end of the optometry school experience. But it came out later that he had some idiosyncratic and amusing little ways of dealing with this. I still remember two of them, which I will share with you. Hopefully you don't have to edit them out. One of them was he joked with us and he said in his lecture notes he would have little annotations, and then when he would say that he told us in a weak moment that when he got to some part of what he was lecturing on that he didn't really feel comfortable with, he was not really sure of it, but he needed to teach it anyhow. He had little notes that said, "Raise voice and wave hands." And I always remember that because I've seen that strategy used by so many of our politicians. That was one thing. The other one was, and this one fell flat the first 2 or 3 times he did it with us, but I can remember him telling us that some of the words in optometry were spelt in unusual ways. They had Latin derivatives and so forth. And I can remember him saying, like ptosis, P-T-O-S-I-S. And he said, and the P is silent, as in sea bathing. And they sat there, and we never got. Thank you, Don. So it took probably a long while, not as quick as Don on that one, but it took us a while to figure this one out. And that one you might have to edit out. So Barry Cole went on. He had small classes. There were 5 in my class. Ian Bailey, Don Mitchell, 2 New Zealanders, which we didn't really count, and actually we're very fond of them. And Don was Tasmanian, so we almost didn't count him. And one other whom I'm forgetting right now. But, that's 5. So Ian Bailey and I often tell people that we were 40% of the class. And we were exactly 40% of the class. But Barry Cole had that class, and Ian and I and Don, he only got 20%. He only got another 40% that actually went on and contributed to the practice of optometry, because Don went and Ian and I went into basically academia. Then there are people whose names you'll know right away: Brian Brown, Alan Johnson, Brian Holden, Leo Carney, Leo's brother, I can't think of his first name, a string of people who have become very well known. That's a lot on Barry Cole. The big mentors in my life, I think, were really 2 others, and there's actually a third that I really would put in that category over a longer period. But one of them was Mert Flom. Rowan's was here before, may have just left. Oh, here she is. Mert took me under his wing when I went to Berkeley, and I learned some very fundamental lessons that I think were incredibly useful to me, and I've seen them being useful to others. Mert used to, those of you who know him, he would take a problem that was presented to him, and he would be very systematic about sorting it out. He'd list all of the arguments for, all of the arguments against. He'd weigh them up, he'd go back and forth, he'd do his homework, and even if he came up with 49 to 51 in favour of, just 2 or 3 points different in favour, he would go with that decision, and he wouldn't, when he presented it, he wouldn't look back. He just did it as though it was always obvious to him, that it was always clear and always something to go for, and then he would do it enthusiastically, knowing all the time that there were downsides and upsides and so on. So I learned that and a lot of things from that. I learned not to try and write with him because he was too careful. He did that too. Because he was almost tedious with the corrections and so forth. But I learned a great deal from him. So Mert would be very high on the list. Another one is an ophthalmologist, name that you might know is Arthur Jampolsky, who founded the Smith-Kettle Eye Research Institute. He's still alive. He's 94 or something like that. I think Don was one of his patients years ago as a child. And he might outlive all of us, but he's still in there, hanging in. Jampolsky. And I learned a lot of things from him. Again, a very positive approach, risk-taking. And I think the one thing, most of all, he used to say, and he acted, people are more important than things and processes and institutions. When you place your bets, place them on people. And I thought, whoa, that's not immediately obvious, but it's pretty wise, I think. Another mentor was one who stayed with me in tough times, was my thesis advisor, Gordon Heath. And I'm not quite sure what he taught me, except maybe the inquisitive part. He was somebody who asked more questions of the people in the class than they asked of him. And I learned from that.
I love that. And it's neat to have Roanne with us today and hear a little bit about her dad and how Mert influenced you so early in their career. So what really motivates Tony? What really makes you do the things that you do?
Well, I'm not sure. Curiosity, I think. I'd like to see things grow. I'd like to see success. I'd like to see obstacles removed. I'd like to approach things with an excess of optimism, knowing that there'll be disappointments or all of my optimistic expectations won't necessarily come true. And I like the unexpected. So I actually, unlike maybe I think Carla was thinking, or maybe others, when you suggested this format, I thought, I haven't done that before. That might be fun.
So you've had the opportunity to be in the profession now for pretty much 5 decades. You've seen a lot of change. Optometry was very different in the late 1950s as you were attending at the University of Melbourne. But you've also had the opportunity to see optometry from a vantage point that many of us never get to see. What guidance would you have for the profession for the next couple decades? What guidance or counsel would you have going forward?
That's a tough one too. I think growth for a profession, not just for an individual, is pretty fundamental to health. And whether it's in ideas or in knowledge. But I think I worry only about the time when optometry thinks it's in such good shape that it just can sit still. I'm trying to think who it was, but somebody I read recently said it's good that you make advances, but if you stay in the same track, you'll get run over. And I think that optometry will probably continue to grow for lots of reasons. I think that most of the time that I've been in the profession, its growth came a lot from being an underdog, feeling put upon. Fighting ophthalmology was probably one of the sources of strength of the profession. I remember telling David Sullins, whom you probably know of, I told him I'm worried if optometry gets all of the legislation things it wants and it's satisfied, because then it won't have any fire in its belly to do other things. And I think that's not quite true. I think what we've done, we've emerged so that we get growth for other reasons. But in the early stages, I mean, that was what motivated me as a student. I can remember doing some ridiculous things, going down and harassing optical shops that I thought were being supported by ophthalmology and being propped up and so on. I mean, as a student. And I know that it's only been the last 10 or 15 years that I'm no longer spurred on by, senses of being maltreated, partly because I haven't been. But I think the new growth is from knowledge, from desire to help patients even more than we're able to now, to get firmly planted as the primary eye care profession, which means we've got to have all of those tools, some of them legislatively acquired, some of them by education. I think those are going to cause an appropriate ongoing growth. But I do worry that we'll get to a point where we're so self-satisfied with where we are that we will lose a little of that fire that I think is needed for growth.
Well, let's hope not. Let's hope we continue to move forward with the profession. All right, well, I'll take it easy on you here. Tell us a little bit about Elma. Which I know she didn't travel with you, but talk a little bit about your wife and tell us a little bit about her.
Okay. Why didn't she come with me? Well, the answer is that she's got a very full life herself, and that's great. She is a very patient, thoughtful, runs at a different, fortunately for her, at a different meter than me, different energy levels. I met her at Indiana University, as I mentioned, and she's become, like myself, sort of preoccupied, almost obsessed with our grandchildren. She's taken a stronger and stronger interest in seeing things that she's always wanted to see. Last year we were in the Arctic Circle seeing polar bears on a National Geographic expedition. Now, I wouldn't have never ever have guessed that I would be on that, but it was magnificent, and thanks to Alma. She's a great lifelong partner. I'm trying to think, with 45 years anniversary just a month or two ago. We're looking for the 50th. And next year she's stated that her 70th birthday present is going to be, we go on another expedition, this time to the Celtic islands of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland on the ship. And that's fine. My only comment is that's great, that blows the kids' inheritance. And we're not too worried about that part of it, but so she's very special.
It sounds like she's been very supportive of you over the years and
tolerant.
Well, yeah, that's a little different than supportive, isn't it? But it takes a spouse when you're doing the quality and the quantity of things that you've been able to do. It takes a spouse who is supportive or tolerant, at least, of what you're doing to be able to do those things. So it sounds like she's been a real blessing to you.
And supportive. I mean, she's put up with a lot,
though. As you look back over your career thus far, and the best may still be yet to come, but what would you point to as your most significant accomplishment or your most lasting contribution to the profession? Where do you think that lies in the body of work?
That one's actually pretty easy. I think it's the mentoring record. The research has had its high points. It's had some fairly low points. Right now is a real high point. Hopefully I can tell you a little bit about that tonight. But I'd say the most satisfying, I don't know whether one would list it as an accomplishment, but the most satisfying part of my professional life has probably been the things that I've gotten out of mentoring, the things that have, I think, contributed to the profession because of those associations. They humble me, actually, when I see how well some of these people are doing.
Maybe since Don's here, maybe you've got a good, quick Don and Carla story. I don't know. You've got something that's, something really embarrassing would be good.
I would like that.
Do you have one?
Oh, I've got more than one.
Okay. Well, considering time constraints, we may need to be selective.
I've got one that's okay for prime time. But I will say to Don, Johnny Ringo's in town. You'll have to ask her about that later. When Don and Carla started their PhD training, they actually came on, which is a bit unusual for graduate students. They came on at the beginning of the summer, that's prior to the fall semester, and they knew what they wanted to do. And I don't remember, Don, whether the grant had already been written or if it was in the process of being written. And I was just coming off this stint on the vision committee where we were doing a sort of history of myopia, answering the question, is there an epidemic of myopia, basically, is I think what it was. And it was a literature review and trying to get statistics and things. And they actually did a lot of the digging out of the literature for that. And then they decided they would do a longitudinal study of myopia in a town just over the hills from Berkeley called Orinda, which had become, in optometry, fairly famous, the original Orinda study. Hank Peters and some of those people know as well. And so the summer, I suggested that they do a couple of things that I thought they'd never forgive me for. One of them was to just completely immerse themselves in the literature. I said, be like monks. Go to the library and be like monks, and just dig it all up. And I was reminded then of Gerald Westheimer's comment that 5 months in the lab. With 5 months in the lab, you can save 2 weeks in the library. It took me a long time to get that one too. That was one thing I did to them. And then the other one was send them to Oklahoma. And Don remembers that one. There was a fellow there whose name I can't...
Dave Goss and
Goss and the other one?
Van Bean.
Yes, he's the one I'm thinking of. It seemed to us that he was the only one that knew how to photograph the crystalline lens in a way that you could make measurements from. And their project was to do all of the biometric measurements of the eye as it grew. Cornea, lens surfaces that were relevant, axial length, and so on. And he did it by, I think, basically a still photography method, and then some mathematical analysis and probably calipers and things like that back in those early days. And they went to see how he was probably the best at being able to do this, how they could transport that into something else, like a video system, which they ultimately created with the help of Chris Johnson. And that completed the circuit for them. But I do still remember them telling me how much there was not in wherever it was in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. They had maybe one movie theater, and maybe one place you could get food that they wouldn't bother to call a restaurant. And at that time, I mean, I'm sure it's a thriving metropolis now. But that, I thought they'd never forgive me. So when they came back into the fall, they started off with a pretty good run at it. They knew they'd already, because I think of just native talent, they were critical of things that needed to be critiqued, and they saw the strength of certain things, and they got on with it, and the rest is history.
Can you think of other stories that would be even better? Or?
Well, the grant writing was pretty fun.
Sure.
I've forgotten that.
If you could redo something in your life, if you're a golfer, what do you call it? Take a mulligan. If you could redo something in your life, what do you suppose it would be?
That's the hardest question that you've asked me.
I'm working on it.
I don't spend any time thinking about how to redo something. And maybe that's a fault. I think I would like to have been a bit more patient with some people in my life, some of my people, and I in retrospect wish I'd been a lot less patient with some others. That mostly came during my stint as a dean. I think I never shared this with Mel, but I think I found out things that I was exhilarated by people I thought I knew, and I found out things I wished I never did find out about other people that I thought I knew. And I think I'd like to have been a bit more patient in life in general, not just in that dean's period, but not push to do things at the speed that I wanted them done, perhaps, since that didn't always work. But I think I would have been perhaps, maybe I'm just getting old and curmudgeonly, I think I, in retrospect, would have been a little less patient with some others that were probably getting on with their own business anyhow, and I thought I needed to give a lot of attention to it, and it probably wasn't very important to. But mostly it's be patient with more people.
So you obviously, as we talk, had a varied career and a lot of experiences managing people, dealing with people, mentoring people. What life lessons would you share with our students, our faculty, our staff that are here with us today, what kind of life lessons, would you sum up and say, here are just a couple things I would want you to know and want to share with you to maybe make their lives a little more easy or better or more productive, however you want to look at it?
That's not an easy question either. It's not easy to be concise, as you've noticed. It's not easy for me to be concise. There's things that are lessons for me as I think back. And one of them is I'm struck by how more and more indistinguishable giving and receiving is. They're sort of closely intertwined. And most of my life, I could not have thought of them that way. So that's a bit deep, but that's for me. And I think if I'd learned that earlier in life, life might have been even richer. But that's one. I think the other is the things I've learned from mentors. I think that it's healthy in the growing sense to set your course enthusiastically, have done your homework, and optimistically, and energetically. And I think if you can bring those things to whatever enterprise you're in, you've got an awfully good chance of succeeding. And I think talent and competence is a good bit further down the list. So that's a bit heretical, I think, but competence is important. But I believe that knowing what you want to do and approaching it energetically, enthusiastically, and with optimism is a message I would love my grandchildren to have.
Good deal. We're going to open it up for just a couple minutes for any questions from the audience. And if you have questions, we'll repeat them so that they're on the video and everything. But I'd like to at least give you the opportunity to have a few questions with Dr. Adams, and hopefully you've learned a little bit more about him as we've done that. So, questions from the audience. Buckeye Bob.
Tony, I have the pleasure of teaching the history of optometry here at Ohio State to our first-year students, and so since you knew Dr. Fry, what remembrances might you have of him?
So, Dr. Newcomb's asking about remembrances of Dr. Glenn Fry.
I was fortunate enough to interact with him a number of times in my early days, including right here. I just had enormous admiration for him as a scientist and as a rigorous person who was fairly rigorous in his thinking. I had more trouble understanding some of the experimental devices he had set up in his lab, and he had a few.
We all did.
You all had trouble with that. I'm remembering something that might seem not very important, but I think it was to me, that people would come in here, the story had it, and I actually saw it once, so I know it happened at least once. And he had a habit of working standing up in the early days. I don't know if that's generally known, but he would work at like a podium like this, and he would work late into the night. And there are all kinds of stories about his wife wanting to know whether he'd been lost or, checking with the police and so on, to make sure he hadn't been in an accident and so on. But he's just a stately, rigorous, highly regarded colleague who could seem to many of us younger people to be pretty opaque in his science. That is, we knew he was doing good things, but we couldn't always follow every detail of them. And I can remember as a student, most of our physiological optics labs were somehow generated by him or by people here at Ohio State that had done it. So, he's a grand memory and deservedly respected and honoured, and his name to this building is totally appropriate.
Other questions? Not at all. We're going to let it go on that. Very Rohan.
I heard rumors that back in the 60s or 70s, there was some crazy research going on at Smith Kettlewell. Care to discuss that, just for fun?
Dr. Flom's asking about some obscure, crazy research going on at Smith Kettlewell in the 60s and 70s. Is this right?
Yeah, that was actually before I was born. It was kind of crazy. It was at the Arthur Jampolsky Smith Kettlewell Eye Research Institute. Then it used to be called something else, SCIBS, I think. And we, that is Rowan's dad, Mert, and myself, and George Mertz, some of you know that name, when he was a graduate, when he was an optometry student, a fellow at Langley Porter UCSF Medical Institute, who was a specialist on marijuana and drug effects on the brain. Jampolsky, who was sort of accommodating us in his facility. We did this collaborative research on vision functions and alcohol and marijuana. So yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy not in the sense that we had to be the subjects, but because we didn't. In fact, that would have probably killed the research right there. Although we did one time notice in the waiting room a little plant that was growing, that because we used a lot of musicians who were out of work from downtown San Francisco as subjects, and we were about ready for a federal government site visit. You know this story? And we noticed this little plant, and of course one of our very kind subjects had actually planted this some time before. It was in a waiting room, and it was fairly visible, but there was other plants. That would have also killed us if that plant had been there the next day. So that's crazy. Your dad was especially crazy because one time he wanted to do an alcohol and phoria test on me. So he fed me alcohol, and far too much. In fact, he had to drive me home, but my phoria changed, I can tell you. I mean, I'm not sure it broke into a frank diplopia, but it changed. So yeah, it was crazy, and it was a good time. We had collaborated with some very impressive people that weren't even in our field. Rhys Jones was the name I was trying to think of, who's something of an expert, and he testified a number of times on medical marijuana in the early years. I don't remember which way he testified, but he... and those were the days when we discovered that marijuana changed intraocular pressure. It was one of the things we discovered. We thought it was a small effect, it probably was, and probably more to do with relaxation than it was. We got the same effect with alcohol, the same effect with, I forget what the other one was, but a drug that calms you down. And so then there was a big push to try and put this in an eye drop. Do you remember any of that? Is any of it? No? The problem is that it was pretty severe on the eye, everything that they tried, and it probably wasn't a good idea to even be trying it, but it was someone in Atlanta I can't think of. So those were the crazy, those were about 5 years in there. Before I got into what I'll talk about tonight, I think of my crazy drug phase, that is drug research phase, with the exception of the crazy drug that your dad gave me that one day, alcohol. The myopia with Don and Carla and that whole crew that they grew, and there was a predating that was what I call my goldfish era. So we'll save that one for another time. That was my PhD thesis work, looking at goldfish, and that's how Dick Hill came into my life, because Dick was an expert on recording from animal retina, and he did famous work in the early days on ganglion cells that could detect motion. I don't know if any of your students have to go through that now, but before he made a big name in contact lenses, he had done this rabbit work. So that's an animal phase.
I see a pattern here, Tony. I hear I do. I hear your story, and then we know that Dr. Augsburg, who's the president of the ICO, leadership at 2 of our institutions, was also big on the horizontal gains nystagmus study here at Ohio State. And he has a story very, very similar to yours about his inability to get home and recognize family. So it's very interesting that they ended up being leaders of our institutions. I don't know if there's a commonality there or not, but it's an interesting observation.
I think if I'd known that, I wouldn't have allowed myself to be in the experiment. If it was already in the literature and Errol has done it, fine.
Any other questions from our group? Tony, we thank you for being a good sport today. Thank you so much for being here.